History of the World by J. M. Roberts, Book 5, The Making of the European Age, Chapter 2, Authority and its Challengers. Reformation helped the English Parliament to survive when other medieval representative bodies were going under before monarchical power, though this was far from the whole story. A kingdom united since Anglo Saxon times and without provincial assemblies which might rival it made it much easier for Parliament to focus national politics than any similar body elsewhere. Royal carelessness helped too. Henry VIII had squandered a great opportunity to achieve a sound basis for absolute monarchy when he rapidly liquidated the mass of property, about a fifth of the land of the whole kingdom, which he held briefly as a result of dissolutions. Nevertheless, all such imponderables duly weighed, the fact that Henry chose to seek endorsement of his will from the national representative body in creating a national church still seems one of the most crucial decisions in Parliament's history. Catholic martyrs died under Elizabeth because they were judged traitors, not because they were heretics. But England was far less divided by religion than Germany and France. 16th century France was tormented and torn between Catholic and Calvinist interests. Each was, in essence, a group of noble clans who fought for power in the wars of religion, of which nine have been distinguished between 1562 and 1598. At times, their struggles brought the French monarchy very low. The nobility of French came near to winning the battle against the centralizing state. Yet, in the end, their divisions benefited a crown which could use one faction against another. The wretched population of France had to bear the brunt of disorder and devastation until there came to the throne in 1589, after the murder of his predecessor, a member of a junior branch of the royal family, Henry, king of the little state of Navarre, who became Henry IV of France and inaugurated the Bourbon line whose descendants still claim the French throne. He had been a Protestant but accepted Catholicism as the condition of his succession, recognizing that Catholicism was the religion most Frenchmen would cling to, a continuing strain in the identity of nationhood. The Protestants were assured special guarantees which left them a state within a state, the possessors of fortified towns where the king's writ did not run. This very old fashioned sort of solution assured protection for their religion by creating new immunities. Henry and his successors could then turn to the business of re establishing the authority of a throne, badly shaken by assassination and intrigue. But the French nobility were still far from tamed. Before this, religious antagonism had been further inflamed by the internal reassessment of the Roman Church, which we remember as the Counter Reformation. Its most formal expression was the Council of Trent, a general council summoned in 1543, which met in three sessions over the next 13 years. It was dominated by bishops from Italy and Spain, and that helped to shape it. For reform challenged the church little in Italy and not at all in Spain. The council's decisions became the touchstone of orthodoxy in discipline and doctrine until the 19th century, providing standards to which Catholic rulers would rally. Bishops were given more authority and parishes took on new importance. The council answered by implication too. The old question about the leadership of Catholic Europe from this time, it lay indisputably with the Pope. Like Reformation, though, Counter Reformation went beyond forms and principles in a new devotional intensity, rejuvenating the fervor of laity and clergy alike. Besides making weekly attendance at Mass obligatory, regulating baptism and marriage more strictly, and ending the selling of indulgences by pardoners. It sought too to redeem rural districts sunk in traditional superstition and an ignorance so deep that the missionaries who sought to penetrate them in Italy spoke of them as our Indies, by implications in as great a need of the gospel as were the heathen of the New World. Yet a spirituality and spontaneous fervor already apparent among the faithful in the 15th century fed the Counter Reformation too. One of the most potent expression of its new mood as well as institution, which was to prove enduring, was the invention of a Spaniard, the soldier Ignatius Loyola. By a curious irony, he had been a student of the same Paris College as Calvin in the early 1530s, but it is not recorded that they ever met. In 1534, he and a few companions took vows. Their aim was missionary work, and as they trained for it, Loyola devised a rule for a new religious order. In 1540, it was recognized by the Pope and named the Society of Jesus. The Jesuits, as they soon came to be called, were to have an importance in the history of the Church akin to that of the early Benedictines or the Franciscans of the 13th century. Their warrior founder liked to think of them as the militia of the Church, utterly disciplined and completely subordinate to papal authority through their general, who lived in Rome. They transformed Catholic education. They were in the forefront of missionary efforts in every part of the world. In Europe, their intellectual eminence and political skill raised them to high places in the courts of kings. Yet, though it brought new instruments to the support of papal authority, the Counter Reformation, like the Reformation, could also strengthen the authority of lay rulers over their subjects. The new dependence of religion upon political authority, that is to say, upon organized force, further extended the grip of the political apparatus. This was most obvious in the Spanish kingdoms. Here, two forces ran together to create an unimpeachably Catholic monarchy long before the Council of Trent. The reconquest, so recently completed, had been a crusade. The title of the Catholic monarchs itself proclaimed the identification of a political process with an ideological struggle. Secondly, the Spanish monarchy had the problem of suddenly absorbing great numbers of non Christian subjects, both Muslim and Jews. They were feared as a potential threat to security in a multiracial society. The instrument deployed against them was a new one, an inquisition, not like its medieval forerunner under clerical control, but under that of the crown. Established by papal bull in 1478, the Spanish Inquisition began to operate in Castile in 1480. The Pope soon had misgivings. In Catalonia, lay and ecclesiastical authority alike resisted, but to no avail. By 1516, when Charles V, the first ruler to hold both the thrones of Aragon and Castile, became king, the Inquisition was the only institution in the Spanish domains which, from a royal council, exercised authority in all of them, in the Americas, Sicily, and Sardinia, as much as in Castile and Aragon. The most striking effects had already been what was later called ethnic cleansing, the expulsion from them of the Jews, and a severe regulation of the Moriscos. This gave Spain a religious unity unbreakable by a handful of Lutherans with whom the Inquisition found it easy to deal. The cost to Spain was in the end to be heavy, yet already under Charles, a fervent Catholic, Spain was, in religion as in her secular life, aspiring to a new kind of centralized, absolutist monarchy, the Renaissance state par excellence. In fact, and incidentally, the first administrative organism ever having to take decisions about events all over the globe. The residues of formal constitutionalism within the peninsula hardly affected this. Spain was a model for counter Reformation states elsewhere and one to be imposed upon much of Europe by force or example in the century after 1558, when Charles died after a retirement spent largely in his devotions in a remote monastery in Extremadura. Of all European monarchs who identified themselves with the cause of the Counter Reformation as extirpators of heresy, none was more determined and bigoted than Charles's son and successor, Philip II of Spain, widower of Mary Tudor. To him had come half his father's empire: Spain, the Indies, Sicily, and the Spanish Netherlands. The results of his policies of religious purification in Spain had been variously interpreted. What is not open to dispute is the effect in the Spanish Netherlands, where they provoked the emergence of the first state in the world to break away from the old domination of monarchy and landed nobility. What some call the revolt of the Netherlands and the Dutch, the 80-Year War has been, like many other events at the roots of nations, a great source of myth making, some of it conscious. Even this, though, may have been less misleading than the assumption that because, in the end, a very modern sort of a society emerged. It was a very modern sort of revolt, dominated by a passionate struggle of religious toleration and national independence. That could hardly be less true. The troubles of the Netherlands arose in the very medieval setting. The old Burgundian inheritance of the lands of the richest state in the northern Europe, the duchy which had passed to the Habsburgs by marriage. The Spanish Netherlands, 17 provinces of very different sorts, formed part of it. The southern provinces, where many of the inhabitants spoke French, included the most urbanized part of Europe and the great Flemish commercial center of Antwerp. They had long been troublesome, and the Flemish towns had at one moment, in the late 15th century, seemed to be trying to turn themselves into independent city states. The northern provinces were more agricultural and maritime. Their inhabitants showed a peculiarly tenacious feeling for their land, perhaps because they had actually been recovering it from the sea and making polders since the 12th century. North and South were to be the later Netherlands and Belgium, but this was inconceivable in 1554. Nor could a religious division between the two then be envisaged. Though the Catholic majority of the South grew somewhat as many Protestants emigrated northwards, the two persuasions were mixed upon both sides of a future boundary. Early 16th century Europe was much more tolerant of religious divisions than it would be after the Counter Reformation got to work. Philip's determination to enforce the decrees of the Council of Trent explains something of what followed. But the origins of trouble went back a long way. As the Spaniards strove to modernize the relations of central government and local communities, which meant tapping a growing prosperity through more effective taxation. They did so with more up to date methods and perhaps less tact than the Burgundians had shown. Spanish royal envoys came into conflict first with the nobility of the southern provinces, as prickly and touchy as other nobilities of the age in defense of their symbolic liberties, that is, privileges and immunities. They felt threatened by a monarch more remote than the great Charles, who they felt had understood them. He spoke their language, even if he was Charles's son. The Spanish commander, the Duke of Alva, they argued, was further violating local privilege by interfering with local jurisdictions in the pursuit of heretics. Catholic though they had a stake in the prosperity of the Flemish cities where Protestantism had taken root and feared the introduction to them of the Spanish Inquisition. In addition, they were as uneasy as other noblemen of the times about the pressures of inflation. Resistance to the Spanish government began in thoroughly medieval forms in the estates of Brabant, and for a few years the brutality of the Spanish army and the leadership of one of their number, William of Orange, united the nobles against their lawful ruler. Like his contemporary, Elizabeth Tudor, William, nicknamed the Silent because of his reputed refusal to allow unguarded anger to escape him when he learned of his ruler's determination to bring his heretic subjects to heel, was good at suggesting sympathy for popular causes. But there was always a potential rift between noblemen and Calvinist townsmen who had more at stake. Better political tactics by Spanish governors and victories of the Spanish armies were, in the end, enough to force it open. The nobles fell back into line, and thus, without knowing it, the Spanish armies defined modern Belgium. The struggle continued only in the northern provinces, though still under the political direction of William the Silent under his until his murder in 1584. The Dutch, as we may now call them, had much at stake and were not encumbered as their southern co-religionists had been with the ambitious dissatisfactions of the nobility. But they were divided among themselves. The province could rarely come easily to agree. The provinces could rarely come easily to agreement. On the other hand, they could use the cry of religious freedom and a broad toleration to disguise their divisions. They benefited too from a great migration northwards of Flemish capital and talent. Their enemies had difficulties. The Spanish army was formidable but could not easily deal with an enemy which retired behind its town walls and surrounded them with water by opening the dikes and flooding the countryside. The Dutch, almost by accident, transferred their main effort to the sea, where they could do a great deal of damage to the Spanish on more equal terms. Spanish communications with the Netherlands were more difficult once the northern sea route was harried by the rebels. It was expensive to maintain a big army in Belgium by the long road up from Italy, and even more expensive when other enemies had to be beaten off. That soon became the case. The Counter Reformation had infected international politics with a new ideological element. Together with their interest in maintaining a balance of power on the continent and preventing the complete success of the Spanish. This led the English first to a diplomatic and then to a military and naval struggle against Spain, which brought the Dutch allies. The war created almost fortuitously and incidentally a remarkable new society, a loose federation of seven little republics with a weak central government called the United Provinces. Soon, its citizens discovered a forgotten national past, much as decolonized Africans did in the 20th century, and celebrated the virtues of Germanic tribesmen dimly discernible in Roman accounts of rebellion. Relics of their enthusiasm remain in the paintings commissioned by Amsterdam magnates depicting attacks upon Roman camps. This was in the era we remember for the work of Rembrandt. The distinctiveness of a new nation thus consciously created is now more interesting than such historical propaganda. Once survival was assured, the United Provinces enjoyed religious tolerance, great civic freedom, and provincial independence. The Dutch did not allow Calvinism the upper hand in the government. Later generations came to think they saw a similar linkage of religious and civic freedom in Elizabethan England. This was anachronistic, although comprehensible given the way English institutions were to evolve over the next century or so. Paradoxically, one part of this was a great strengthening of the legislative authority of the state, one which carried the limitation of privilege so far that at the end of the 17th century it was regarded with amazement by other Europeans. For a long time, this cannot have seemed a likely outcome. Elizabeth had been an incomparable producer of the royal spectacle. As the myths of beauty and youth faded, she had acquired the majesty of those who outlived their early counselors. In 1603, she had been queen for 45 years, the center of a national cult fed by her own Tudor instinct for welding the dynasty's interest to patriotism, by poets of genius, by mundane devices such as the frequent travel which kept down expenses since she stayed with her nobility, which made her visible to her people, and by her astonishing skill with her parliaments. Nor did she persecute for religion's sake. She did not, as she put it, want to make windows into men's souls. It is hardly surprising that the accession day of good Queen Bess became a festival of patriotic opposition to government under her successors. Unhappily, she had no child to whom to bequeath the glamour she brought to monarchy, and she left an encumbered estate. Like all other rulers of her day, she never had a big enough income. The inheritance of her debts did not help the first king of the Scottish House of Stuart, who succeeded her, James I. The shortcomings of the males of that dynasty are still difficult to write about with moderation. The Stuarts gave England four bad kings in a row. Still, James was neither as foolish as his son nor as unprincipled as his grandsons. It was probably his lack of tact and alien ways rather than more serious defects that did most to embitter politics in his reign. In defense of the Stuarts, it can be agreed that this was not the only troubled monarchy. In the 17th century, there was a roughly contemporaneous crisis of authority in several countries, and one curiously parallel to an economic crisis which was Europe wide. The two may have been connected, but it is not easy to be sure what the nature of the connection was. It is also interesting that these civil struggles coincided with the last phase of a period of religious wars, which had been opened by the Counter Reformation. We may at least assume that a contemporaneous breakdown of normal political life in a number of places, notably the British Isles, France, and Spain, owed something to the needs of governments forced to take part in them. In England, the crisis came to a head in a civil war, regicide, and the establishment of the only republic in English history. Historians still argue about where lay the heart of the quarrel and the point of no return in what became armed conflict between Charles I and his parliament. One crucial moment came when he found himself at war with one set of his subjects, for he was King of Scotland as well as of England, and had to call Parliament to help him in 1640. Without new taxation, England could not be defended. But by then, some of its members were convinced that there was a royal scheme to overrun the church by law established from within and to reintroduce the power of Rome. Parliament harried the king's servants. Charles decided in 1642 that force was the only way out, and so the Civil War began. In it, he was defeated. Parliament was uneasy, as were many Englishmen, for if you stepped outside the ancient constitution of kings, lords, and commons, where would things end? But Charles threw away his advantage by seeking a foreign invasion in his support. Those who dominated Parliament had had enough, and Charles was tried and executed in the eyes of the contemporaries, an astounding outcome. His son went into exile. There followed in England an interregnum during which the dominant figure until his death in 1658 was one of the most remarkable of all Englishmen, Oliver Cromwell. He was a country gentleman who had risen in the parliamentary side's councils by his genius as a soldier. This gave him great power, for he provided his army, stood by him, he could dispense with the politicians, but also imposed limitations on him, for he could not risk losing his army's support. The result was an English republic astonishingly fertile in new constitutional schemes as Cromwell cast about to find a way of governing through Parliament without delivering England to an intolerant Protestantism. This was the Commonwealth. The intolerance of some parliamentarians was one expression of a many sided strain in England. Protestantism, which had been named Puritanism. It was an ill defined but growing force in English life since Elizabeth's reign. Its spokesman had originally sought only a particularly close and austere interpretation of religious doctrine and ceremony. Most early Puritans were Anglicans, but some of them were impatient over their church's retention of much from the Catholic past. As time went by, it was to this second tendency that the name was more and more applied. By the 17th century, the epithet Puritan also betokened, besides rigid doctrine and disapproval of ritual, the reform of manners in a strongly Calvinistic sense. By the time of the Republic, many who had been on the Parliament's side in the Civil War appeared to wish to use its victory to impose Puritanism, both doctrinal and moral, by law not only on conservative and royalist Anglicans but on dissenting religious minorities. Congregationalists, Baptists, Unitarians, which had found their voice under the Commonwealth. There was nothing politically or religiously democratic about Puritanism. Those who were the elect might freely choose their own elders and act as a self governing community, but from the outside, the self designated circle of the saved, they looked and were an oligarchy claiming to know God's will for others, and therefore all the more unacceptable. It was a few untypical minorities, not the dominant Protestant establishment, which threw up the democratic and leveling ideas which contributed so much to the great debate of the Republican years. The publication of more than 20,000 books and pamphlets on political and religious issues would by itself have made the Civil War and Commonwealth years a great epoch in English political education. Unfortunately, once Cromwell had died, the institutional bankruptcy of the Republic was clear. Englishmen could not agree in sufficient numbers to uphold any new constitution, but most of them, it turned out, would accept the old device of monarchy. So the Commonwealth ended with the restoration of the Stuarts in 1660. England, in fact, had her king back on unspoken conditions. In the last resort, Charles II came back because Parliament said so and believed he would defend the Church of England. Counter Reformation Catholicism frightened Englishmen as much as did revolutionary Puritanism. The struggle of king and parliament was not over, but there would be no absolute monarchy in England. Henceforth, the crown was on the defensive.